What is up, Scream Team? Zach Cherry here, and this video is my complete and detailed plot breakdown of Scream 7. As I did for the last two movies, I am once again going to be going through everything scene for scene, offering an extensive critique of the film, talking about what I liked, what I didn't like, and in a lot of cases, things that could have been changed in order to make this a better movie. I understand that Scream 7 is a very polarizing film for a lot of reasons, but I am reviewing this in good faith, and I try to be as fair as possible and approach the material authentically and respectfully. So if it seems like I am being very negative, it's not me being a hater, it's just how I am and it's my perspective. You might actually be surprised by some of what I have to say here. So without any further ado, let's get into Scream 7. The movie starts in Woodsboro, California, where the Macher house has been transformed into an Airbnb themed as a crime scene to commemorate all the murders that took place there. Arriving for the night are Scott and Madison, a stab franchise fanatic, and his girlfriend, who has reluctantly agreed to accompany him. Upon exploring the house, Madison is frightened by an animatronic Ghostface in the living room and expresses her feelings about not wanting to be there. Scott suggests that they drive back home, but Madison decides to stick it out. He then pranks her by calling as Ghostface and dressing up in the mask and robe. However, the real Ghostface is revealed to have swapped places with the animatronic in the living room and kills Scott. Madison is then chased upstairs, where after a tussle is left hanging from the chandelier while Ghostface falls to the floor below. Madison is unable to hold her grip and drops down onto Ghostface, who positions his knife upward, causing her to fall onto it. As she lays on the floor bleeding, Ghostface gets up and douses the room with gasoline. He sets Madison on fire and exits the house as it ignites in a blaze behind him. I want to start out on a positive note here, because the first thing I notice when the movie starts is Marco Beltrami's score. Besides the fact that this particular opening arrangement immediately lets us know this is a Scream movie with the notes of Sidney's lament, it also adds a nice creepy vibe right out the gate. I think Marco's scores have really been missed over the last two films, and I have nothing against Brian Tyler as a composer. I liked what he brought to the table, but when it comes to Ghostface and Sidney Prescott, it's really nice to hear Scream again. As far as how this scene plays as an opening, while it's a very traditional horror set piece, I actually like it because it doesn't rely on gimmicks, which is something that was an issue for me in both Screams 4 and 6. It's also not simply redoing a previous opening scene like the way that Scream 5 was an homage to the original opening. So this turned out to be my favorite opening scene since the first three films. The Macher house is back, this time again filmed on a soundstage, and obviously it can't be the real location because they burn it down, but it's really hard to tell because the exteriors feel like an authentic and convincing outdoor environment. The interiors have also been restored to match the way it looked in 1996, so you can tell that a lot of time and money went into making this version of the house than what went into Scream 5's version that we see in the third act of that movie. The way the house is shot this time around really gives you a sense of the space and makes it so much more atmospheric and creepy. Kevin Williamson is not afraid to move into wider shots and hold them there for a longer period of time, which feels more akin to Wes Craven's style of filmmaking than more of the really up close and tightly framed shots that Radio Silence seemed to favor. And just all the misdirection with the mannequin. That was quite inspired. It lends itself to a certain rewatchability, especially with how the animatronic Ghostface is framed in the deep background. It's very interesting to analyze the scene and try to determine at which point did the real killer swap himself out with the dummy. Even the use of light and shadow in this scene and how we get that wonderful homage to Michael Myers with the mask just slightly appearing out of the darkness. For reasons like that, this scene really commits to the mood. I think that Scream 7 as a whole loses points with a lot of its supporting characters, which I will get into as we make our way through this review, but the couple in this scene, Madison and Scott, they are so much more realized than I would have given them credit for based on what we had seen in the trailers. What works about them is that we know exactly who they are from the moment they appear. I find them to be very charismatic, their relationship feels authentic, and those are details that definitely go a long way in heightening an opening set piece like this. So I feel like this as a standalone scene is probably going to have more replay value for audiences. It certainly feels that way for me. But a complaint I've heard about this scene is that it isn't connected to the rest of the movie, other than teasing the prospect of whether Stu is back or not. And I do agree with that as a criticism. It lacks a certain cause and effect. And I suppose if we really wanted to make it make sense, the killers are literally burning down the legacy of the original in the same way they are planning to do that with Sidney figuratively. But if the through line misdirect is that Stu is alive, then that opens up a whole line of questions that aren't being answered, such as what purpose would Stu have for burning down his house? Who legally even owns this house now? Surely Amber's parents didn't turn it into an Airbnb to exploit the murders. But it would have been interesting to find out the history of the property, especially in the last 5 years, because even if this was a case of Stu being teased as the killer, it's not being done for anyone's benefit other than the audience's. This event is barely mentioned in passing later on, so as the inciting incident of the movie, it really doesn't have any causation to set the story in motion. It doesn't affect the outcome of anything. In terms of the kills here, there's some CGI employed throughout the movie that is a little distracting to say the least. Scott's death with the eye turning back in his head is one of them. I like the idea in theory, but I wish the film had relied more so on practical elements and then used maybe just a little bit of CGI to help tie it together. With Madison's death, I think this was a missed opportunity to do more. For instance, we cut away to Ghostface when she's getting torched, which feels a bit safe. We had seen Amber ignite on fire in Scream 5, so this comes off as being reductive for the franchise, but beyond that, I think the more effective thing to do with her would be to have Madison alive until the very final moment of the scene. So rather than douse her in gasoline, Ghostface should have just let the house burn around her while she's bleeding out. That way we can linger on the suspense and terror as she tries to navigate her way out of the house. And I appreciate that we didn't get the Ghostface slashing into the title card because that was definitely being overplayed. But rather than simply have him walk away from the burning house into the title card, it might have been better to stay on Madison and have her flip over while trying to crawl out, and that's where the chandelier could have fallen down onto her, literally crashing into the screen, and have that be the reveal of the title card. The same night in Pine Grove, Indiana, Tatum Evans is visited by her boyfriend Ben, who surprises her by entering the house through her bedroom window. The visit is short-lived, however, as Sidney Prescott, now revealed to be going by Sydney Evans, catches Ben hiding behind her daughter's bed and sends him home for the night. Tatum calls Sidney a hypocrite, considering that Billy Loomis had snuck in her bedroom as a teenager, and Sidney expresses that she just wants Tatum to be smart and less trusting. However, Sidney becomes closed off when Tatum starts asking questions about her mother's relationship with Billy, and abruptly ends the conversation. We're also introduced to Sidney's husband Mark, who we find out is the town's police chief. The two share an intimate moment before bed, and the next morning we find out that their two youngest daughters are staying with Mark's mother while their house undergoes renovations. Tatum is getting ready for school, but Sidney notices that she's wearing her old leather jacket from college and immediately becomes uncomfortable by it. Tatum once again presses Sidney for information about her past, but Sidney shuts down and tells Tatum that all that information is available online and in the movies. I've heard a lot of complaints about this scene of Ben sneaking in the window, specifically being a riff on the scene from the first movie, and while I understand where people are coming from, as the franchise seems to always be copying itself, and Ben talking about watching Stab and being inspired to sneak through Tatum's window does feel like the movie is forcibly trying to make him appear like a psycho killer. But I don't fully mind the scene because we are getting the nuance of seeing Sidney on the other side of this interaction. She's now the parent. It presents a dramatic perspective shift that I think was attempted in Scream 4 with Jill and Trevor, but it never really meant anything for Sidney there, and was rather more so an ominous beat for the audience. So this time we're actually getting to see how this mirror has changed Sidney and affects her on a character level. I had mentioned in my initial review that I don't find Tatum to be a very accessible character. I think her conflict with Sidney feels very unfocused. Specifically, we're being told two different things that kind of contradict one another. On one hand, Sidney is painted to be this overprotective helicopter parent that is stifling her daughter's upbringing. But on the other hand, Sidney is very reserved with Tatum in terms of sharing her history with her, which presents a relationship which is based on a lack of communication. Now, two things can be true, but the problem is that Tatum is constantly pushing at Sidney to open up to her. I don't think that the character is wrong for wanting to know about her mother, but the way it's written doesn't feel authentic. Especially as a rebellious teenager, I would expect Tatum to mirror Sidney's behavior behavior as a way to psychologically connect with her mother. And in that way, they would probably be shown to have a very cold and distant relationship. So I do think that less is more, and this movie spends a lot of time having Sidney and Tatum explain their feelings to one another rather than showing them. And one gripe that I do have with their first interaction here is that it goes on a little too long, especially considering that they have a whole other conversation together the next morning. I think it would have worked best if after Tatum called Sidney a hypocrite, we just cut right to the scene of Sidney and Mark in their bedroom, and the mother-daughter dynamic is left on a charged beat until the next scene. Because as it stands right now, Tatum wearing the Scream 2 jacket just feels accidental. Like Tatum just randomly chose a jacket she likes and is confused as to why this would bother Sidney. But if the scene had been framed in a way where we could see that Tatum intentionally picked that specific jacket out because she knew it would cause a stir, that adds a whole new layer of tension onto their dynamic. In terms of the franchise timeline where Sidney's kids are concerned, Tatum would have been born 2 years before the events of Scream 4. I have no problem retconning that Sidney had left Tatum with Mark while she was on her book tour, even though Rebecca specifically implies that Sidney is single.
The problem with Sidney is that she never gets laid.
But this would have also been a great opportunity for a scene between Tatum and Mark, where we learned that the distance between her and Sidney could have been there from a young age, as Sidney was always off doing publicity. And that could have played into the idea that Sidney got to a point where she did make a conscious decision to prioritize her family, and that's why she made the shift to disappear from the public eye. And let's just say that that could have been something that happened around the time where the two younger daughters were born. That could have created another layer of resentment that Tatum has for her mother. I just think there was a much cleaner way they could have presented the history within this gap, and it would have created a really solid narrative foundation for this conflict. On her walk to school, Tatum meets up with her friends Hannah and Chloe, the latter of which we find out is dating Tatum's neighbor Lucas. The other girls find him to be creepy, with Tatum mentioning that he is obsessed with Sidney. As they continue walking, Ben drives by and offers the girls a lift to school. Across town, Sidney arrives at the Little Latte, a local coffee shop she owns and works at. She serves a man named Carl who gives off an ominous vibe, but she shrugs it off and just goes back to her business. The creepy neighbor kid Lucas also shows up and starts talking to Sidney about various documentaries that detail the New York City Ghostface murders. He says he has a keen interest in true crime and wants to start his own podcast. Lucas's mother Jessica shows up and scolds him for bringing up a sensitive subject to Sidney, and the two women bond over motherhood, with Sidney expressing her need to always let her children feel safe and protected. We find out that Jessica had an abusive ex-husband, and she tells Sidney that it's not a safe world, and if she protects her children too much, they'll never learn how to protect themselves. This is a series of scenes that acts as an introduction to all of our supporting characters. I personally think the franchise did it best with the quad scene in Scream 2, where we get to languish in these large-scale environments and meet all of the players in a very fluid and organic way. And to be fair, Scream 7 can't really do that because Sidney's work life and Tatum's friend life are completely separate. It feels very reminiscent of Scream 4 in a way where there's a lot of ping-ponging back and forth between storylines, so it's edited to be more so vignettes than an overarching set piece, but I feel like most of the dialogue in these earlier sequences end up serving absolutely no purpose. If the characters reveal anything about themselves, it's mostly surface level details like Hannah having a party or Chloe being attracted to Lucas. Otherwise, most of the conversations are about Sidney, and for example, they do this in Scream 4 when Kirby, Jill, and Olivia are talking about Sidney coming to town, but it works contextually there because it reveals who those characters are in relation to Sidney. For instance, Olivia feels that Sidney's presence is a bad omen, which tells us that she's hyper aware of danger. Kirby reveres Sidney and aspires to be her in a way, which tells us that she's overly confident to a fault. And Jill postures herself to a point where she's coming off as being very blasé about Sidney, which we eventually learn is a tactic she uses to hide the fact that she's really obsessed with her. So this is actually very smart writing because it reveals who the characters are by what they're not saying. And where Scream 7 is concerned, that's just not happening. Everything we're being told is establishment and filler, and because it's such on-the-nose dialogue, when we do hear something that stands out, it becomes a massive red flag. Like, it's really hard hard to not meet Jessica and immediately peg her as one of the killers because she's the only character of the lot who divulges any sort of personal background information. They made the same mistake with Quinn in Scream 6 when she talked about having a dead brother, where this sort of exposition just becomes obvious indicators of who the killers are. I don't mind the way they introduced and handled Carl, considering what we're going to soon find out about him, but with Jessica, something that might have been a little more subtle and better presented an honest friendship between her and Sydney is if the coffee shop was sponsoring the school play that we find out about, and Sydney was providing pastries and coffee for that event. Jessica could have been part of the school's PTA who was coordinating everything, and then at the very least, it gives Jessica a way to reveal her personality and quirks through that role, and it also further establishes the school play and connects all of the characters together into one storyline. It's also another way to see who Sydney is as a parent and a member of this community, rather than just being there stocking shelves and slinging cappuccinos. I'm sure some of you might think this is super nitpicky, but little adjustments like this would strengthen intention and streamline everything. It makes a huge difference in the way we view and interact with the story and characters. At the school, the students are rehearsing a production, with Hannah playing a fairy who is strapped into a harness attached to a flying wire rig. After Tatum misses her mark, she is chewed out by the school's drama teacher, who tells her that she is too timid and needs to channel her mother's fire. This causes Tatum to become insecure, and in the dressing room, she asks Ben if he feels that she lacks confidence and wonders why he likes her. Across town, Sydney receives a phone call at work from the killer. She responds incredulously at first while recording the call, but then the killer switches to FaceTime and reveals himself to be STU MACHER, who appears to have survived Woodsboro in '96 and is hideously scarred from the TV that she dropped on his head. He shows Sydney that he is outside of Tatum's school and threatens to harm her, causing Sydney to jump into action. She races to the school theater in her car, while also alerting Mark and the rest of the Pine Grove police force. Back at the school, Hannah is on the stage practicing the flying mechanism with another student named Aaron who is working the controls. Ghostface slashes Aaron's throat, then causes the rigging system to slide back and forth across the stage, leaving Hannah vulnerable to his attack. He eviscerates her by holding a knife up in her fly path just as Sydney arrives with the police. Sydney shoots at Ghostface but misses him, where he is then able to get away. After the murders, the police are gathered at the school, interviewing students. Mark assures Sydney that Stu is dead, and what she saw was likely a deep fake, which raises instant alarm bells for her when she remembers that Ben will be going to college to study computer science. In terms of the Stu MACHER video calls, I'll save my thoughts for later on because there's a lot to say about that, and I want to condense it all together in one block, so I'm just gonna focus on the theater here. I think this is one of the better set pieces in the movie. In my opinion, Hannah gets the best kill. There are some CGI effects, but I think they're combined well with the practical elements. Also, the staging, the lighting, the cinematography especially is excellent stuff. McKenna Grace is clearly one of the best performers in this movie, as she so effortlessly brings a presence to this role. My problem, however, is that her death feels very rushed. A lot of people are making a correlation between McKenna Grace here and Sarah Michelle Gellar in Scream 2, and what's interesting is that both kills occur at almost exactly the same timestamp, which really highlights a flaw in Scream 7's character economy, since we have already gotten such a good sense of who Cece is by the time she's taken out, and with Hannah, she's really gone before we know her. For whatever reason, she mentions here again that she's having a party that night, and this just feels like an egregious waste of screenplay real estate. Beyond the fact that this party is clearly not happening now, it's baffling that such an irrelevant fact needed to be brought up twice, let alone at all. In addition to that, we have another NPC kill with Aaron, who even less so feels like a loss for not only the other characters, but the audience as well. Scream 6 really leaned into the safety of taking out mostly non-characters, and while Scream 7 is definitely more intentional with its victims, it still begs the question, why should we care about these people? Having said that, I like the character of Ben. I don't think that the movie ever reaches the full potential of how to use him or to create a nuance that separates him from some of the other boyfriend characters in the past, but I appreciate that there's depth to him because I find the other friends, Chloe and Lucas, to be very lackluster as characters. We're told that they're dating each other, but I don't understand the purpose of establishing this coupling when we're mostly having it explained to us. Especially because Lucas's behavior in this scene when he's parroting what Ben is saying to Tatum about the drama teacher makes it seem like he's more fixated on Tatum, and given that Lucas is already shown to be obsessed with Sydney, an obsession with Tatum by proxy would feel like a better trajectory for his character, especially if the goal is to establish him as a red herring. But in the scene where Tatum is with Ben in the costume shop, this could have been used as an opportunity to present the other friends as viable suspects by weaving them in and out of the picture. In the next scene, everyone is being earnestly interrogated for having disappeared, so it feels like the movie should have shown this to us. And if the intention for Lucas was shifted to have him interested in Tatum rather than Chloe, having him lingering in the background watching with contempt as Tatum kisses Ben, that would have been some nice texture to paint him as the creepy suspect that the movie is continuously labeling him as. And I actually thought the costume shop was a really neat set with the cage and the rows of costumes, and I loved seeing Ghostface hiding back there, so I think they could have made more use out of this space. Like, even if it were as simple as Chloe investigating a strange noise, that would give the film an opportunity to create more tension leading into Hannah's murder, and it would also add context as to why the group is suspicious about Chloe's whereabouts when we get to the next scene. There's no point in Tatum suddenly being suspicious of Chloe. It feels forced and out of character and never gets addressed again. And then the drama teacher is another anomaly because the film makes such a big ado about him, and he is featured on the cast poster only to completely disappear after the first act. The random info about Ben being a computer junkie is just more tell, don't show. This is all pretty much the same problem I had with the radio silence Scream movies, where the writing and direction is just really bad at setting up red herrings. The family leaves to head back home, where Sydney plans an emergency exodus, but after the police do a thorough sweep of the house, they neglect to check the attic, where Ghostface has been quietly hiding. He sneaks down and manages to hold Tatum at knife point, but after a scuffle with Mark, Ghostface knocks him out at the bottom of the stairs and chases Sydney and Tatum into a panic room in the master bedroom where they lock themselves in. Realizing she needs to save Mark, Sydney sneaks out of the room through a space between the walls, but Tatum insists on coming with her. Ghostface tracks their movement, however, and after getting stabbed through the wall, Sydney is able to escape the house with Tatum. Ghostface races downstairs, but he's surprise attacked by Mark, and they end up on the front lawn where Sydney joins the fight. They're able to push the killer out onto the street, where he is then struck and killed by an oncoming vehicle. The car pulls over, and Gale steps out along with Chad and Mindy, who are revealed to now be working with her as her cameraman and producer. Sydney and Gale reunite, and when she tells Gale about the killer claiming to be Stu, they unmask the dead Ghostface, revealing Carl, the man from the coffee shop earlier that day. I think all the Sydney and Tatum conflict actually works here. It's much more focused at this point now that things have hit closer to home. Sydney's overprotectiveness feels like a direct cause and effect, and Tatum has more of a reason to push back against it and defend Ben in a way where she correlates everything to Sydney's past indiscretions. I still think they should have breadcrumbed this conflict in earlier scenes because this is now the second time that Tatum has directly brought up Billy Loomis, and I think it would have hit much harder if this was the first time she was mentioning him. When we get to the house, I will say for this entire sequence, the blocking and fight choreography is doing a lot of great work, and I think it's mostly well shot. I think the lighting could have been a bit better. There's this uniform dimness throughout the entire scene where I think more dramatic lighting choices could have enhanced the vibe, especially within the spaces between the walls. Everywhere in this scene looks the same, and cinematography wise, I feel like it just could have done a little bit more. I wouldn't say this feels flat, but there is a repetition as Sydney and Tatum are making their way through where I think they could have played more with the camera and framing. Even by not showing us Ghostface on the other side of the wall, that might have ratcheted up the tension. But we also have to remember that it is hard with a scene like this because similarly to the bodega scene in Scream 6, we're putting our lead characters in danger very early on in the movie. So, whatever happens, we know that nothing bad is going to come of this for them, and it really drains the scene of any sort of tension. So what has to be done instead is you really have to rely on the visuals to make it work. And I think that this is all visually so much more dynamic than what the bodega scene is in Scream 6. And it does, in a way, harken back to the laundry chute set piece from Halloween 5. But when you look at that scene, it's really taking its time. There's also a lot of layers to the danger. Jamie has to climb up this vertical chamber. The hatch is open at the bottom with the killer reaching in to grab her. And here it feels very rushed. And this is a problem I've seen with many chase scenes and set pieces in modern horror, where the act of going through the motions seems to be enough to satisfy the studios. And I think this is a fine scene, but it could have been elevated and made that much more rewatchable if Ghostface was also finding a way to get inside the wall and grab at them. Or even if Tatum's jacket got stuck on something during this lateral crawl while the knife was still being jabbed at them, rather than having the jacket get stuck on the ladder after they've already made their way out. Speaking of which, does it bother anyone else that she left the jacket behind? She should have been wearing it throughout the whole movie, especially since they made such a huge fuss about it. Unironically, I love Ghostface getting Final Destinationed off the road. In fact, I think this whole turn of events of a Ghostface killer getting got partway through the movie is a fun twist. It's something that's been talked about a lot over the years, with fans asking to see a twist like this, so it's not so much a surprise, but I think comparative to what they had done with the opening of Scream 6, where we get a killer reveal early, this works so much better because it actually plays into the context of the full story. Now, this is also the first part of the movie where I feel we hit a point of no return, and not in a good way. I love Gale's entrance here. As ridiculous as it is, it still feels like it commits to the earnestness and sincerity of the film's more mature tone. But the inclusion of Chad and Mindy, I fear, completely destroys that vibe. I'll speak more to Chad and Mindy as we move along here, but for this scene in particular, the moment they step into frame, I feel like the movie loses a lot of credibility. I've really liked Chad in the past, maybe not so much Mindy, but they do not fit into this movie at all. Their inclusion feels like a studio decision to appease fans of 5 and 6 and to create, I guess, more of a link between films. And it's one of those scenarios where Scream 7 is trying to do way too many things and please way too many people, and a lot of those elements end up not meshing together. It is discovered that Carl Gibbs escaped from a psychiatric hospital 2 weeks prior, and that he had been incarcerated there for killing 3 women in the past. Sidney feels that this was way too easy, and that there must be another killer. Mindy tries to usurp Gale's position as reporter and insists that Chad record her while she goes live, but Gale intervenes and stops them, where Robbie Rivers, a local news reporter, tries to get the scoop from them, but Gale shuts him down as well. She also inserts herself between Sidney and Jessica and Lucas when they come by the house to check on her, where Gale seems to be immediately suspicious of Lucas, which makes Jessica uncomfortable. Inside the house, it is revealed that Gale now has a tremor from the nerve damage incurred from her attack in New York. It is also discovered that Gale lost her network job and is now rebranding herself as a crime reporter. She tries to recruit Sidney into helping her find the killer, but Sidney thinks it's best for her to stay with her family where she can protect them. She changes her mind, however, after the killer FaceTimes again as Stu, prompting her to suggest they begin their investigation at Fallbrook Psychiatric Hospital, where Carl Gibbs escaped from. So, like I said, this is where the movie starts to lose me a bit, and even though my belief that including Chad and Mindy in this feels forced, there was still a way they could have done this where it could have impacted the story much more than it does. For instance, if we had found out that Gale hired them because she had some sort of residual guilt over Randy's death in Scream 2. Randy getting killed was kind of the catalyst for Gale's first major character evolution in the franchise. It's the moment that cemented her as one of the good guys, and I don't need there to be some saccharine monologue explaining all of this, but if there was some thread of this throughout the movie, it would go a long way in justifying these relationships. But the movie isn't interested in showing us what the twins' relationship with Gale is. It tells us about it, which goes back to my problem with the newer movies being all tell and no show. But they introduce all 3 of these characters and then immediately split them up, and there's no goal throughout the movie of either faction of this trio ever attempting to reconnect or work as a team. Even looking at their priorities, I mean, Chad is just kind of there, but for Mindy, we learn very quickly that she's trying to steal Gale's spotlight, and it's a conflict that just kind of exists for the sake of having conflict. When I think of Scream 2, Gale's cameraman Joel comes into the picture, and we immediately get a sense of his relationship to Gale through their conflicting values, and we watch that play out over the course of the movie. I know exactly who those characters are together and how they feel about one another. And here, where there's even more of a demand to understand how this alliance came to be, we're given exposition which feels exactly like what it is. The movie is talking to the audience. The fourth wall has been broken, and not in a clever or meta or satirical kind of way. It's just a very awkward situation that takes you out of the cinematic world, especially with how Mark and Tatum are side-eyeing each other, almost as if they're acknowledging the fact that they have just joined a Fast and Furious-like franchise. We also have another encounter with Jessica, and one of the issues I have with her as a character is that when she shows up, nothing she says or does really affects any of the other characters, and it becomes a huge missed opportunity for her as the killer. Admittedly, this is an issue I also have with Roman in Scream 3, but the difference there is that Roman doesn't really interact with Sidney or Gale at any point in that movie, and seeing as how Jessica is presented as being Sidney's best friend, or at the very least, the only friend of hers we're shown in Pine Grove, it becomes another underdeveloped relationship that completely relies on what we're being told. Right now, we are being robbed of any sort of emotional depth, which makes the betrayal of the eventual reveal very underwhelming. When you look at the past killers who had close ties to Sidney, like Billy, Mickey, and Jill, they all played on Sidney's fears and emotions throughout their movies, and while Sidney is definitely more immune to that kind of manipulation at this point, it doesn't mean that Jessica should not at least try. I think 7 movies in, whoever the new killer is should at the very least aspire to be more successful than the Ghostface killers who came before them. But this scene is less concerned with her and instead focuses more on Lucas and just doubles down on him as a suspect by repeating the exact same information of him being fascinated with the Ghostface murders. So when it comes to establishing the killers, or even any character in general, it's not so much about the quantity of screen time as much as it is the quality of it. Randy maybe has 8 minutes of screen time in the first movie, but he makes such a huge impression. And every time characters like Jessica and Lucas show up, their only purpose becomes filling a scene count quota. And there's so little to tell about them that they end up recycling the same beats, which makes all of their scenes feel like filler. But with all of those gripes aside, I feel the Sidney and Gale aspect of this is what's working really well. I think above all else, this movie really cements Sidney and Gale's relationship as the backbone of the franchise. It's the one thing that has consistently evolved, even partially in 6 when Sidney was absent, and that really emphasizes the impact that these two characters have on the franchise and one another. Giving Gale nerve damage after what happened in Scream 6 was the right choice here. It's something that creates an even stronger connection between her and Dewey by allowing for her to mirror him in the way that he developed a limp after all of his attacks. I just wish we didn't have so many silly off-the-cuff references to Scream 6. At this point, it's fair to say that Sidney has evolved into a character who will now flock towards danger when it relates back to her, but it never made any sense for her to go to New York. Her family is her priority, as we are told in this scene. So even though her sitting out New York is kind of the inciting reason for the events of this movie, Sidney had no reason to be there, and it feels like they're really trying to force this as a character flaw for her, which feels very unnatural. The next day, Tatum asks Sidney if she can go with her and Gale on their investigation, but Sidney tells Tatum that it's too dangerous and that she doesn't have the skill set if things get out of hand. Tatum says that she doesn't want to end up like the other Tatum by having her head crushed in a garage, and tells Sidney that she wants her to show her how to be a fighter. Sidney refuses, and the mother-daughter pairing leave things on a tense note. On the way to the hospital, Sidney calls the Woodsboro coroner's office and finds out that the intake form for Stu's body is missing, and nobody is able to confirm if Stu was ever brought in, as the coroner from 1996 passed away several years earlier. Sidney and Gale conclude that someone is trying to make it seem like Stu is alive, but they don't want to rule out the possibility that it could actually be Stu. At the hospital, they are greeted by Supervisor Marco Davis, who allows them to take a look at Carl's room. Sidney shows Marco a photo of Stu from her recorded video and asks if Carl ever talked about him. Marco recognizes Stu as a former patient named John Doe, who had been there since the late 90s. Marco claims that John had suffered amnesia from the blow to the head that gave him his facial scars, and also tells them that he was a drifter who attacked a high school girl but was later found incompetent to stand trial and ended up at the hospital where he stayed until his release 2 weeks prior. Marco cannot give them any more information without a court order, but he claims that John Doe and Carl Gibbs were close friends. As the police have already been working on tracing the killer's calls to Sidney, she suggests to Gale that they bait him into calling her by the two of them doing an interview on live television. I think this is another example of how the conflict between Sidney and Tatum isn't working. I love the fact that Tatum throws it in Sidney's face that she was named after a victim and uses that as a way to get under her mother's skin, because that fuels the tension between them. But then everything else feels very whiny with her wanting to be included. It's coming off like a kid who wants to stay up past her bedtime, and the sentiment about wanting to be a fighter just like you, it's more on the nose dialogue where we have a character telling us exactly what it is they want. The thing is, it's more interesting and effective when a character can convey what they want through subtext and emotional nuance, and this isn't anything new for the franchise. Sam and Tara are huge offenders of this kind of on-the-nose dialogue and forced conflict, but even more so with Tatum, when you consider that she's a teenager interacting with her mother, it's not realistic for her to be saying very specific things like this. In terms of this whole STU MACHER red herring, there are aspects to this that I really enjoy. This feels like the first time since Scream 3 that our characters are actively investigating a legitimate mystery that isn't just about figuring out who the killer is. So my ears perk up when we start hearing about missing coroner intake forms, deceased morgue attendants, and John Does who are identified as having the same physical appearance as Stu. I love intrigue like that, especially in a Scream movie. I almost wish they leaned even more into it, like give us a Psycho 2 reference with Stu's coffin being exhumed. This whole setup that they're doing here is actually very reminiscent of the Sunrise Studio archive scene with Carrie Fisher in Scream 3, but the thing with that scene is that it leads to a discovery that pushes the story along. There was a clear cause and effect that led to Milton, which then led to the Hollywood parties. All roads eventually led back to the reveal of Maureen's secret child. And my problem with what's happening here in Scream 7 is that none of this stuff goes anywhere. Obviously, that's because the Stu and AI of it all is completely inconsequential, but even still, the storyline takes a hard turn after this because we pivot to Sidney and Gale doing an interview in order to lure the killer to make a call so they can trace it. The two threads are completely unrelated, so the events of this scene don't really justify the solution moving forward. As far as Marco goes, and this being his only scene before the unmasking, I do think that he is another very predictable killer. Maybe it's because I never bought the idea that Stu was alive, or because they pushed the narrative really hard that it was AI all along, but as soon as Marco corroborated the story, it felt very obvious that he would be involved. There's also so many plot holes that are presented with this, and you better believe that I'm going to address them, but even if I try to suspend disbelief for a moment, with law enforcement now getting involved in order to get this court order for John Doe's paperwork, it's going to become very obvious to them that Marco lied when they discovered there never was a John Doe to begin with. So this sort of all becomes a plot thread that leads nowhere, never gets resolved, and makes everyone seem stupid for buying into it. And as much as I enjoy the intrigue of this mystery, it needed to be thought out way more than it was, because because a hidden in plain sight character like Marco should not have been so blatantly suspicious. Back in Pine Grove, Mindy decides that she is going to take another stab at uncovering the killer, believing it to be someone in Tatum's friend group. She gets Tatum to agree to gather the suspects together in one room, but since the town has declared a curfew, Tatum will need to sneak around her father, with her motivation being that she wants to show her parents that she can be useful. Meanwhile, Mark is working on getting the court order to release the files on John Doe, but while at home, looking for Tatum, he is drawn into the garage by a noise. When he goes to investigate, Ghostface attacks him from behind some sheets of plastic from the renovation, and Mark is stabbed several times, leaving the town without its police chief. I love that Tatum flat out asks Chad and Mindy, "Why are you here?" It's like the movie is hyper aware of the bad decisions it's making, but all of my previous gripes aside, why are they here and not with Gale? Chad mentions that their uncle Randy was really good friends with Sidney, and even though that is technically true, when have we ever seen Sidney have a conversation with either one of these two? Even a small exchange of dialogue, just one line. It's never occurred. Their emotional ties to Legacy are so tenuous that the movie has to constantly remind us who they are related to, just in case we forget. Obviously, Sidney has already left to go to Fallbrook at this point, but then you have Tatum asking the twins how they're settling in. I'm sorry, but Tatum's relationship to them does not evoke memories or feelings of Randy. None of these people were even alive during Randy's lifetime. They don't know him. Give me Sidney checking in on the twins instead. Let there be a moment where one of them says something to Sidney that creates a flicker of pain or laughter or some sort of vibe that lets us know that Randy's spirit is still alive in her heart. But if these characters absolutely had to be in this movie, pairing them up with Tatum was the least interesting thing they could have done. Because honestly, I would much rather see Chad and Mindy interacting with Gale, especially with how important journalism has suddenly become to them. And I'll get more into the issues I have with Chad and Mindy's plan when we get to the tavern scene, but something that annoys me here is that Tatum is all for going along with their idea. To me, it highlights an inconsistency in her character because it's never clear if she's doing this rebelliously or because she actually thinks it's a really good idea. She mentions that she'll need to sneak around her father to get out of the house, but she also says that whatever information they uncover, she'll pass along to him. I mostly think that Tatum is presented as a smart character, and it seems like the script treats her like she's a smart character, but this is the only time in the movie where I'm not sure the script fully understands what to make of her. This is either an act of rebellion against Sidney that is not explicitly clear, or it's a contrived miscalculation on her end to get her to a place where she will inevitably be in danger. On a positive note, I really like the fake out kill with Mark in the garage. It's a very well shot and modestly suspenseful set piece. We've got another great moment of Ghostface appearing like Michael Myers behind the plastic. The sound design also really elevates it. I think the only thing that held it back for me was that this scene was heavily shown to us in the film's marketing, and even though for a set piece it's kind of basic, I think it's still doing a lot on a technical level. As the sun sets over the town, all the local businesses close up shop early, with everybody going to their homes. Tatum, Chad, and Mindy sneak out to Parker's Tavern, a local pub owned by Chloe's family. Chloe, Ben, and Lucas have already assembled there, and Ben uses his computer science skills to analyze the images of Stu from Sidney's FaceTime call, concluding that they're too convincing to prove whether or not they're AI. Mindy thinks the idea of Stu being alive is too ridiculous, and conjectures that the new killer is a fan of Sidney Prescott rather than a fan of the Stab franchise. She and Chad proceed to interrogate the group, running through the traits that make them all unique suspects. I'm all for the music usage of Red Right Hand appearing in every Scream movie. At this point, it's been in all of them except for Scream 4, but I don't know if I needed this whole curfew montage, which is almost a shot-for-shot recreation from the original. We already had the bedroom scene earlier on. I think there should be a one-scene cap on how many direct homages a new Scream movie can make, because it gets to a point where we're just drawing comparisons to the original, and it shines a light on the inferiority here, because these homages start to look more like tacky replicas. In terms of the tavern setting, I think this is my least favorite environment in the film. One criticism I've heard from a lot of people is that Scream 7 looks like a Hallmark movie. Obviously, we're in a small town setting here, so the locations aren't going to be overly intricate or large scale, but that doesn't mean they shouldn't feel like a world exists around them. I don't imagine that Pine Grove is any different in size and population than Woodsboro in the first movie, but when you watch the original, you get the scope of the world. You can chart the geography through every location. You feel the life of the community within scenes that are more than just mere establishing shots, and we don't really get that here. Most of the settings are very self-contained and feel detached, and I think this might just be a Spyglass Studios thing because it's felt this way ever since they took ownership of the franchise. They don't want to allot their budget to commandeering larger spaces, which would then need to be filled with hundreds of extras. This was never a problem when the films were produced by Dimension. Wes Craven understood that the world needed deep background detail, and they gave that to him. And just as an example, in Scream 6, the few outdoor scenes we have feel very boxed in. There's a smaller location scope, and they use lenses that blur out the background and instead opt for a few establishing shots to highlight the extras. It's literally doing the bare minimum. And I realize I'm going off on a tangent here because this current tavern scene is clearly an indoor location, but you have the characters talking about needing to lay low since every business in town has been mandated to shut down for curfew. But even to have a police car drive by as the characters watch from behind the darkened windows, something like that would add texture to the environment because they're not doing anything to sell the authenticity of this location, and it feels more like a movie set than it does an actual tavern. To speak to the Agatha Christie of it all, as Mindy says, the thing that bothers me the most about this scene is that we have Chad and Mindy making the same mistake for a third time in a row now, which is essentially the proposal to gather all of the suspects together and tell each one of them to their face why they might be the killer. Realistically, if you suspect someone of being the killer, you are not going to want them to know that you know. It's an aspect of these movies that they really started to lean into with Scream 5, and it just feels so immature and silly. I think it's way more interesting when they pair up two characters who form an alliance and have them speak openly to each other about who they think the killer is. There's just something much more raw and personal about that. It allows the script to expose the cracks between the characters and their relationships. It's just much better writing, and I think it's a huge missed opportunity that Chad and Mindy don't get a scene like that together. But beyond that, if a character like Sydney can learn from her mistakes and become smarter and stronger with each sequel, why is it that Chad and Mindy never seem to progress intellectually? Each time, Mindy even acknowledges that she's made mistakes in the past, but then she never applies this learned information moving forward, because the last thing either one of them should want to do is close themselves up in a small space with minimal exit points and a bunch of people they don't know, where one of them could conceivably be the killer. That's just a no-brainer, and it becomes very frustrating to care what happens when the script has no interest in writing characters as real people. At the local TV station, Gale strikes a deal with Robbie Rivers to give his channel the exclusive interview that will broadcast to all the affiliate stations in the state. Tatum gets an alert about the broadcast and watches the interview play out with the rest of the group from the tavern. As the interview begins, Sydney and Gale speak under the assumption that Stu is alive and responsible for the current murders. But after several minutes go by without a call, Gale begins to fill the void by asking Sydney probing questions about her children and why she disappeared from the public eye after writing her book Out of Darkness. Sydney is hesitant to answer any questions, but after Gale points out that she named her daughter after one of the victims of Woodsboro, Sydney proclaims that she actually named her daughter after the last friend she ever trusted, before abruptly ending the interview and walking off set. Sydney then chides Gale and relates her line of questioning back to her if she were to ask about Dewey on live television, to which Gale says that she would let everyone know she's fine, because lying to herself is the only way she can get through each day. With the broadcast already ended, Stu calls Sydney's phone from outside Parker's tavern, where he tells her that Tatum is inside and that he plans on punishing her for having broken curfew. Gale immediately gets Robbie Rivers to call the police and send them to the tavern, but is too late to join Sydney as she has already fled from the TV station and is heading into town on foot. I love the idea of Sydney and Gale baiting Stu to call them. It's an example of our heroes being clever and trying to outsmart the killer, or at least find a crack where they can glean more information or follow another clue. But I don't like how this becomes another plot device that leads us nowhere. We get this wonderful interview between the characters, but the circumstances surrounding it are so arbitrary. If anything, Sidney and Gale have put themselves and everyone else at an even greater disadvantage because they've failed to communicate this plan to anyone, leaving their friends and family separated and open to another Ghostface attack. This is where the movie really starts to feel written, because everything that is happening right now is contingent on people not talking to each other. And that also makes me wonder, why did they need to go to the TV station to do this? Gale has all the equipment and network affiliations. They could have broadcast this entire thing from Sidney's living room. And even if Gale's network didn't want to go for it, and I don't really know why they wouldn't, but I'm pretty sure that she, Chad, and Mindy all have a big enough online presence where they could easily start a trending live stream. All of these people are technically celebrities in the public eye. Robbie Rivers clearly knew who they were when he approached them in the street earlier, so I'm really just confused over what the point of his character is. When they announced Mark Consuelos was playing a reporter, I figured it would be a prominent enough role where he would be not only a potential suspect, but also perhaps a rival of Gale's who is, vying for the scoop. So I don't like when a script will have a surplus of characters whose inclusion is relegated to one specific function, especially a function that could easily be fulfilled by existing characters. So if a character exists in the movie, I would like for them to matter to the story and the other characters, or at the very least be a victim of the killer, and Robbie Rivers does none of that. It feels like so much wasted potential because this could have been a really fun and devious character. But all of my issues notwithstanding, this is still such a milestone moment in the franchise for the fact that we are getting to see Sidney and Gale come full circle from their first scene in the first movie, finally getting this interview. So in a way, this is the evolution of the slap, and I love that we're seeing this ruthless side to Gale, and it's a side that makes sense here. I did not like how she was presented in Scream 6. It was a regression that never fully worked for me because the writers didn't bother to put the effort in to show how she got to that point. So rather than it being a betrayal of Sam, it came off more as a betrayal of Gale's own character. But here, this feels like who Gale is. This is the appropriate evolution. And I love that Sidney says that their friendship is complicated but enduring, because that's a very nice way of sugarcoating it. But it's a friendship nonetheless. And there's something really biting about the way Sidney speaks about Tatum being the last friend that she ever trusted. Kevin Williamson is really scratching at old wounds here, and it's material like this that exemplifies why he's the best person to write for these characters. But this also brings us to the biggest shift in the movie where I feel the problems really start to mount. I know this is a very Stu-centric killer, but we do see him taking on the visage of Dewey later on, which feels like another missed opportunity here, since this could have been a moment for Gale to see her deceased husband and have the killer use that as a way to really cut deep. If they were bringing back dead characters in this way, here is where you would want to have Dewey. So I think there was an overestimation of Stu on the producer's end, where the decisions were favoring fan service over emotional impact. Also, I understand Sidney's choice to flee the station without Gale, as she might have felt she was protecting her by going at it alone. But why on earth is Sidney trying to get into Gale's car? Did she forget that it wasn't her vehicle? Like, obviously there's going to be an impulsiveness when she finds out Tatum is in danger, but it feels really sloppy for Sidney to make the choice to run into town on foot when she could literally go back inside and grab the keys from Gale. Whatever she had to do that would make more sense than this. I think the best option would have been for her to steal Gale's keys the moment she realized what was happening. Either way, just to be clear, I'm not annoyed by the fact that Sidney is running across town on foot. I'm annoyed by the fact that the writers created a situation that depended on unrealistic variables. If they wanted Sidney to run, that's fine. Just make it make sense. At the tavern, Tatum decides that she needs to be with her mom and asks Ben to drive her to the station, at which point the two exit together, leaving the twins alone with Chloe and Lucas, who both conveniently disappear. Chad and Mindy realize they shouldn't have let Tatum leave with Ben, but when they try to leave, they find they're locked in. Ghostface shows up and attacks Chloe in the kitchen, but when she tries to fight back, she accidentally stabs Chad, who came back there looking for another exit. Ghostface slices Mindy, leaving both the twins incapacitated, but when Chloe tries to escape, she runs into Lucas, who gets stabbed while trying to be a hero. Chloe is killed when Ghostface slides her across the bar, wedging a large chunk of glass in her throat, and as Lucas tries to crawl away, Ghostface lifts him up by his head and impales him on a very sharp beer tap nozzle. So remember how earlier I said that Tatum was a mostly smart character? I mean, she is, mostly, but where things were previously confusing in the script, this is a little more blatantly stupid. Why is she asking Ben for a ride to the TV station? Obviously, she trusts him, but with her earlier scene of begging Sidney to teach her to be a fighter, and then the even earlier scene where Sidney tells her that she needs her to be smart about Ben, it makes it seem like this girl is being willfully ignorant, and it further highlights this inconsistency with her character of rebelling against her mother while at the same time turning to her for valuable advice. This movie is having a very difficult time picking a lane with this character, and furthermore, why would she not leave with Chad and Mindy since they're the ones who brought her there? At the very least, Chad and Mindy do acknowledge their mistake in letting her go off with Ben, but this entire scene feels like it's predicated on things happening that would never happen the way they've been written. And to be clear again, that is not me saying that I don't want the movie to happen. I am saying that I would like the writers to create a feasible dilemma that will precipitate the events to play out as they would otherwise. Overall though, I just find this to be a very weak scene for a few reasons. The blocking is not great, lighting continuity is inconsistent, it's very confusing to chart the action and geography throughout the kitchen stuff. Ghostface is clearly stalking behind Chloe before she grabs the knife, and then when she turns around and stabs at Ghostface, it's suddenly Chad, and then Mindy just randomly shows up behind them. It's very unclear. The quick takedown of Chad and Mindy is also an extreme tonal dissonance for what this set piece is trying to accomplish suspense-wise. It's just very cartoonish and kind of takes the piss out of any tension that might have come from Chloe hiding behind the bar while Ghostface creeps around. And I'm glad that they didn't overdo Chad and Mindy's injuries like they have in the past, seeing as how they were going to end up surviving anyway. But this also begs the question as to why did Ghostface not go back into the kitchen and finish them off? They were clearly still alive and writhing on the floor. My feelings for Chad and Mindy aside, the thing that really weighs this scene down for me is that Chloe and Lucas are probably the weakest written characters in this movie. Like, the eventual killers are really bad, but I still think these two are worse. So because of that, I just don't care what happens to them. They're not interesting, they're not funny, they don't have chemistry as a supposed couple. Clearly, Tatum doesn't even give a crap about them because she's totally fine to abandon them and never follow up on their status. So I just feel like we're wasting time with them here, and I also don't really care for either one of their kills. With Chloe, it feels a little anticlimactic that after taking a slide across the bar, all we get is a reveal of her with a shard of glass in her neck. We could have at least seen an insert shot of it going in, or even for her to still be alive after and Ghostface coming over and stomping the glass further into her neck. And then with Lucas and the beer top, I think the CGI looks especially awkward here. Admittedly, I'm not a huge gore hound. Horror movie kills are important to me, but I don't need them to be excessive or mean-spirited, and this feels more akin to Saw or Terrifier or Final Destination. It doesn't really vibe with the Scream tone for me. I also want to address Lucas's kill a little bit more when we get to the Ghostface reveal. I have more to say about it, and I feel the only reason it played out the way it did in this scene was to create a decoy to remove Jessica as a suspect, which to me feels kind of cheap and makes me think that his death could have been saved for a much more effective twist later on. At the same time as the tavern attack, Tatum discovers Ben's laptop in his car, where it appears he was working on a deepfake to turn himself into Stu. He claims that it was done just to see if it was possible, but Tatum doesn't believe him and knocks him out and exits the car, car, only to run into Ghostface in the middle of the abandoned town square. Tatum is able to fend him off and run away, but after screaming for help to no avail, she ends up hiding until the coast is clear. It's here where Ben surprises Tatum out of nowhere, and after convincing her that he isn't the killer, Ghostface jumps out and kills him, giving way to another chase. She ends up at her mother's coffee shop, where she gets in using the key code, but upon discovering that Ghostface knows the code as well, she barricades herself inside the office. As Sidney continues running into town, she gets a security alert on her phone about the shop, and calls Tatum to assist her in arming herself with the gun from the office safe. Using the shop's video surveillance, Sidney tells Tatum where to shoot Ghostface through the wall, and after successfully hitting her target, Tatum leaves the office to finish the job. However, when Tatum tries to shoot Ghostface in the head, he jumps up and attacks her, with a second Ghostface arriving at the shop, leading to her getting ambushed and captured. Whatever this little AI project is that Ben has been working on, why would he not divulge this information to Tatum? And why is he acting so guilty about it? Beyond that though, he is recording very specifically threatening messages that are really hard to take out of context. So it feels like the script is really pushing this red herring, and it's being done in the most contrived way possible. And even then, I think I wouldn't have minded it too much, except for the fact that Ben is going to be exonerated as a suspect in about 20 seconds from here, because not only do we have this Ghostface chasing Tatum, but we also have the Ghostface in the bar. So unless the film is hoping to make us believe that there are 4 killers, this all feels like it's misdirection that is arriving way too late to the story. I at least appreciate the fact that Tatum is not messing around. The second she suspects him, she is whacking his face with that laptop, not once, but twice. Was it the right instinct? Maybe not, but at the very least, knocking him out is much more promising for her potential as a final girl than if she were to just simply run away screaming. The biggest question I have though is, where are the police? We know that Gale had Robbie call them to the tavern, but in a curfew situation anyway, they should be out patrolling the streets. That's the whole point of a curfew. The police need to be there to enforce it, and I'm not going to accept a scenario where the entire police force fell apart at the seams because they lost track of the chief. That just doesn't seem realistic to me. If anything, the 2 deputies in this movie are shown to be rather competent at their jobs, so I would have actually liked to see a few extra kills here with Deputy Meadows and Deputy Cook. We could have had the 2 Ghostfaces take them out at some point here, and then bam, we get some extra kills in the movie, and it makes it a little more believable as to why these streets are completely empty. Also, a curfew means that people are regulated to stay at home. It doesn't mean that they've completely vanished from the ether. So when Tatum is screaming her lungs out, there's no way that people aren't reacting to that or calling the police. And I know some of you will say I need to accept the fact that this is a movie, and sure. The problem though is that this should be a very tense scene, and it's not. And the reason it's not is because we as an audience are going to be distracted by the improbability of this suddenly being a ghost town. I also feel like Ben was a huge missed opportunity here. Like I alluded to earlier, I think he was much more grounded and realized than most of the other supporting characters, so it would have been nice if he had been anything more than just a prop. With the exception of Danny in Scream 6, every boyfriend in this franchise has been killed, and as far as Danny goes, he was extremely underwritten and overall kind of ineffectual to that movie, so I might have been interested in seeing Ben survive Scream 7, more so to see the evolution of what his relationship would be with Sidney rather than Tatum. But if they had to kill him, I wish the script came up with something more clever than Ghostface jumping out of nowhere to stab him. Play into the killer's psychological manipulation like Mickey had done with Sidney and Derek. In fact, what if the program on Ben's laptop had been planted there by the killer? That way, there's an actual cause and effect leading Tatum to lose trust in him. Or in another scenario, they could have kept Ben alive a little longer so that Sidney could find herself in a situation where she's forced to bargain with his life. Something like that would really raise the stakes, especially for her relationship with Tatum. I just find that this movie, more often than not, goes for the least interesting choice every time. Now, just to move away from the negatives, I think that both Neve Campbell and Isabel May deliver incredible performances here. The acting in this scene is top-notch. Tatum is being smart here. She immediately pushes the shelf in front of the door, then pushes the desk up for good measure. Also, I wonder if anyone noticed the fun little Easter egg that the safe code, which is Tatum's birthday, is also Wes Craven's birthday, 0802. It goes without saying that I feel this scene might have landed better if the characters' conflict throughout the movie was a little more believable, but the thing that continues to suck the air out of this scene for me is the lack of tension. We're hearing Ghostface banging on the wall throughout all of this, but we're never seeing him make any progress on getting inside. It doesn't feel like there's a ticking clock here. If the killer had started a fire again, or found a way to leak gas into the office, or had even started to break through the wall, any of that would have justified the urgency of the characters, because otherwise it just felt way too easy. But at the end of the day, this feels like another scene that will probably lose a lot of replay value for me, which is too bad because I think it could have really been the centerpiece of this movie for the outstanding emotional performances. Sidney arrives at the coffee shop, but Tatum and the two Ghostfaces are already gone. The killer calls Sidney, luring her to come home to her house to rescue Tatum, but when she gets there, the TV screens turn on, relaying a message from Stu that was recorded from inside the Macher house. Sidney is taunted by him, along with the AI visages of past Ghostface killers Mrs. Loomis and Roman Bridger, as well as Dewey, before they lead her to the backyard where Tatum is tied up to a chair and gagged. Ghostface stands over Tatum with a knife, causing Sidney to surrender her gun while hiding another one behind her back. He pulls off his mask, revealing himself to be Marco from the institution, and then calls out the other Ghostface, introducing them as Stu. Marco then goes into the garage and pulls out Mark's body, who as it turns out is still alive. This is when the other Ghostface unmasks, revealing themselves to be Jessica. The two joke about the prospect of anyone ever believing Stu to not be dead, and Marco admits to being a former Google security specialist with a background in AI, while Jessica takes credit for bringing Stu back. Jessica tells Sidney that her book, Out of Darkness, saved her life, as reading it had inspired her to kill her abusive husband. She also reveals that she killed her own son because he reminded her too much of him. As it turns out, Jessica idolizes Sidney as the ultimate final girl, but was let down by her for not going to New York during the events of Scream 6. She claims that Sidney's disappearance caused her to check herself into the mental facility where she met Carl and Marco, where she then devised the plan to kill Sidney in front of Tatum in order to start a new cycle of trauma, creating Sidney 2.0, as she now feels that Sidney is past her prime. While Jessica monologues, Mark cuts Tatum's restraints, and she's able to headbutt Jessica, while Sidney pulls out the second gun and shoots Marco in the head. Jessica runs into the garage where Sidney follows her, and after a brutal fight, Tatum runs in with the other gun, and the two shoot off Jessica's face in a hail of bullets. The AI stuff is all very disconnected from everything, especially in terms of the killer's scheme or some kind of meta conversation. It feels like a cheap gimmick born from a studio note to justify the inclusion of Stu and these other past Ghostface cameos. But the movie isn't saying anything about AI. It's not presenting an argument or a commentary, either in the way it relates to movies or even in terms of what it means for the characters. It's just there on a very superficial level. As far as the other dead Ghostfaces are concerned, this is another aspect that feels very random for the fact that we're only seeing 3 of them. And it begs the question, why is it specifically Stu, Roman, and Mrs. Loomis? I think if this was an idea they were going to commit to, they should have got all the Ghostfaces, at least all the ones who were relevant to Sidney, from Billy and Stu all the way to Jill and Charlie. This moment might have felt more complete or intentional if they did have those 7 killers, and I understand why Stu is presented as being older, as that's part of the conceit that he may still be alive, but then for Roman and Mrs. Loomis to appear the way their actors do in the present day, it feels like an oversight. This is AI within the film's universe. Why would they be aged up 25 plus years? They should be appearing to Sidney as she last saw them, right down to their clothing. Neglecting to do that is an aspect that takes me out of Sidney's experience. I'm not seeing this through her perspective anymore. I am seeing this as a fan of these movies who is currently being pandered to. Also, I wasn't a fan of this cheap-looking virtual tour of the Macher house. I think it would have been more unsettling if the characters had morphed or glitched into each other the way we saw it on Ben's laptop when he transformed into Stu. But mostly, I think the biggest miscalculation here was to not have Rose McGowan appear as the original Tatum. This entry, more than any of the other sequels, shows a lot of reverence for this character and her friendship relationship with Sydney, and not to undervalue Dewey's connection to Sydney, but I think the moment would have hit a lot harder if it was original Tatum telling Sydney that she died for her. In all fairness, maybe this will age better over the years. The Scream 3 voice changer has certainly undergone a major reevaluation, but considering this is about AI and very much of right now, I more so feel that this will seem very dated in the not so distant future. On a positive side here, Nev's performance, again, is amazing in spite of how confusing and underwhelming this material is, because the stakes don't feel very high. The killers are outright saying that Tatum is going to survive, as that's the plan, but then they're holding knives to her throat. At the very least, I would have liked for one of them to specify that they don't want to kill Tatum, but they will if Sydney doesn't comply. But these killers don't make any sense. What is their end game? They leave Tatum alive, and then what? Surrender to the police, kill each other in a murder-suicide pact, spend the rest of their lives on the run? Jessica is obviously unhinged, but we don't know enough about Marco to conceivably buy the fact that he would willingly fall on the sword for Jessica's struggle. I do appreciate the bickering between them. That was probably the only thing I liked about them as a pairing, and it's something I wish we had seen with Amber and Richie in Scream 5. But still, it's not enough to establish Marco's motivation. Ironically, I can understand Carl's motivation, being enticed into murdering random people since he was presented as being a murderer in the past. But that also brings up more logistical questions over how these three ended up working together to begin with. Who was parenting Lucas while Jessica was at Fallbrook? Why would Jessica, a woman who fought back against domestic violence, align herself with a man who murdered 3 women? The movie just sort of yada yada yadas over any important background information, which according to Anna Camp was an actual issue she faced during production. She admitted that the character was completely underwritten, and you can really tell here because she is doing the most with nothing at all. Also, speaking of Lucas, apparently the script didn't even acknowledge the fact that she had killed her own son, which was dialogue that she had to ask to be added in. And as it stands here, it's such a throwaway line, but I think something that could have elevated this scene would be if Lucas were still alive at this point. Let's pretend he wasn't killed in the tavern. Maybe he left early or was able to get away during the attack, leaving him as a viable suspect, but then saving his death for this scene where Jessica can literally kill her own son in front of Sydney. No Ghostface disguise, just full spectacle for everyone to see. That would have been insane, and it would have dramatically raised the stakes for Sydney and Tatum to watch this maniac do the unfathomable of murdering her own child. But instead, we just hear about it in a very nonchalant, jokey kind of attitude. I don't think the idea of Jessica being an obsessed fan of Sydney's is the wrong direction here. There's actually a lot of interesting commentary that could have come out of that, but they awkwardly make it all about New York and Scream 6. This was a motive that was so confusing to me, I didn't fully understand it until the second time I watched the movie. However unstable Jessica is, I have a very hard time believing this trajectory. The consequences to Sydney's actions, or rather her inaction in this case, this is a very convoluted motive that required a lot more empathy and understanding within the writing of this character, and that detail just isn't there. Going through everything from start to finish, I think the biggest problem with Scream 7 is that it's trying to please way too many people. The STU AI part of it all doesn't fundamentally align with anything Jessica stands for. Had Jessica turned out to be Stu's sister, this might have landed, but perhaps they were afraid of being too repetitive and having the killer be the family member yet again. But even still, if they were going the Stu route, I might have actually preferred the reveal that it was Stu, with the twist being that the obvious AI technology was in fact not AI after all. One surprise though, which I admit I did not see see coming was finding out that husband Mark was still alive. Maybe it's because his attack and apparent kill was spoiled heavily in the trailer, but I kind of forgot about him after he was taken out. I wish that he had been less effectual though, because it feels like him cutting Tatum's restraints was a little too easy. Again, this is a scene that is devoid of suspense. We've already been told that the killers don't intend on harming Tatum, so this scene really boils down to Sydney and how much danger she could be in. But I feel like we've come to a point where Sydney is so capable of herself that it's hard to imagine a scenario where she would get bested by the killers. I still think that the fight choreography here is really well staged and shot. As I said, this is one of the strengths of the movie, but let's imagine a slight adjustment to this scene, and it wouldn't compromise the core structure of the climax at all. We wouldn't be adding or subtracting any characters. The setting would still be the same. We're in Sydney's backyard. It's not an exciting location for a climax, but by design, it was meant to evoke the original with a victim tied up to a lawn chair. But what is missing here? We don't have a swimming pool. Aside from the fact that a pool would add some much needed texture to the environment, let's imagine that when Sydney shoots Marco dead, he flings backwards into the pool and pulls Tatum in with him, still gagged and tied to the chair. Now, Sydney is put in a position where she needs to rescue Tatum, however, she can't because she's busy fending off attacks from Jessica. This creates a ticking clock. This is the suspense that is desperately needed here. Tatum is going to drown and nobody is able to save her except for herself. This allows Tatum to earn her final girl badge by sliding herself across the bottom of the pool to get hold of Marco's knife and use it to cut herself free and swim to the surface. This is how one small change to the setting can open up a huge opportunity. And quite frankly, this scene needed it. Tatum as a character needed it. And if not that, then something. Because the girl boss moments of shooting the killer's face into CGI tomato soup and prattling off goofy one-liners is beneath the franchise at this point. Scream should be smarter than that. In the final scene, Robbie Rivers reports live in front of Sydney's house as Mark is wheeled out into an ambulance and taken to the hospital. Gale arrives with Chad and Mindy, where she tells them that the network wants a live remote, but steps down and allows Mindy the opportunity to report the story instead. Sydney confronts Gale and acknowledges how Gale has always had her back and how she should have gone to New York. She tells Gale that she does trust her after all, and the two friends embrace. Sydney finds Tatum sitting on the doorstep and divulges to her that Tatum Riley was her childhood best friend and was someone who was funny, outspoken, strong, fierce, and fearless, and she is why Sydney named her daughter Tatum, because that is what she wanted for her in life. With their bond stronger than ever, Sydney and Tatum walk away from the house, and the movie ends as they are joined by Gale, who personally takes them to the hospital to be with Mark. Just to put a cap on the Chad and Mindy of it all in relation to working with Gale, it's a nice sentiment for Gale to give Mindy her moment, but sadly, it wasn't earned. These characters spent the entire movie separated from each other, and even then, didn't have any sort of self-discovery that would allow for this moment to stick the landing, so it mostly comes off like a joke, even intentionally so with the not quite gag reel vibe of the mid-credit scene. However, everything else that's going on here is flawless. I think in spite of my opinion of the film's downward mobility in the final act, this epilogue, while not quite making up for it, does turn out to be a huge moment for the franchise, and that all comes down to Sydney and Gale. This is really the first time their friendship is being acknowledged in a meaningful way. Some of my favorite bits were when these two characters awkwardly skirted around each other because there's always been a layer of tension. So for a fan like myself who has lived with these characters for 30 years, there's a catharsis to this scene. It pays off because it was earned, not entirely within the body of this movie, but over the course of every movie. So with the exception of Scream 6, Sydney and Gale are the emotional spine of the franchise, and I just love the reverence their friendship is given here, because the movie could have easily opted for a Sydney and Mark scene instead, and despite the fact that Mark is Sydney's husband, Kevin Williamson's instincts were correct for this scene to be about Sydney and Gale and their long-standing relationship. In addition addition to that, the final moment between Sidney and Tatum was also quite touching. I still feel that their conflict wasn't presented as best as it could have been. I don't think that Tatum was as accessible as the movie needed her to be, and it has nothing to do with Isabel May. Her performance was very strong, but even though the journey was weak, the destination was exactly what it needed to be, and I can't help but think that it would have been more impactful than it was had the movie made the smarter choices, fine-tuned the conflict, and opted to have Rose McGowan's Tatum appear before Sidney rather than Dewey. If it had just trimmed the fat and only focused on the things that emotionally anchored this relationship, I think this could have been the best epilogue of the franchise. This is certainly one of Nev's strongest performances, and to me, she is the film's biggest saving grace. So even though I have just spent all this time criticizing it, I don't think Scream 7 is a bad movie. I wouldn't even say it's the worst of the franchise. There are definitely elements within it that I would consider to be the worst in the franchise, but it's a film that is marked by having high highs and even lower lows. At the end of the day, I want movies to be good, and regardless of this being a Scream movie, I think it should have tried to be a good movie first and a movie for Scream fans second. If a Scream movie is good, the fan base will embrace it, and that shouldn't involve nostalgia baiting. Scream started out as a very clever, very suspenseful evolution of the horror genre, and now it may as well be the Fast and Furious franchise. To its credit, people love those movies. I love those movies. Those movies make a lot of money. So I've managed my expectations, but I still have a lot of fun pointing out all the holes and diminishing returns. And I hope that you didn't see this review as being too hateful or negative, because for me, it's only about offering a different perspective. I want to thank my Patreon supporter, Dark Meets Light. If you want to see even more Scream-related content, and especially things related to Scream 7, I'm going to have a lot of videos coming out in the near future, so you can check out one of these playlists here. Until next time, I've been Zach Cherry, and I'll be right back.